Hello, Neil. How are you today?
Good morning, Russell. Very well, thank you.
Good. Well, thanks for coming to talk about being a DDO. You're the Diocesan Director of Vocation and Ordinands in the Diocese of Hereford. I wonder, would you like to start by telling us a bit about what a DDO actually is?
Certainly. In a sense, I have the honour of being the one office which all clergy know about and hardly any laity do, which is to say, my responsibility is to meet people who are feeling a call to, in fact, any kind of ministry, but especially to ordination, to support them and work with them through the church's processes, which may or may not discern that they are called to ordination, and if they are, send them into training and support them through training up to ordination. So all clergy have known a DDO and passed to one of our hands, as it were.
Fantastic, thank you. And you've just alluded there to the different processes there are for selection for clergy, for training and formation up to ordination. And I suppose I want to start by just observing that despite all those elaborate processes, there isn't actually much ecclesiastical law concerning those topics. So why is that?
Well, indeed not. It is an oddity, and well, it's probably easy to explain historically. So within the canons, as the good students of ecclesiastical law who are listening to this can look up, there are some brief references saying, bishops should not ordain people without due consideration that they're suitable, but it's not very finely defined. Whereas in fact, there are quite lengthy processes of interview by panels, and which have been around in one form or another since basically just after the war. And the history of it is, and this is all in a book by Robert Rice, if anyone wants to look up further, that in the late 19th, early 20th century, the bishops kind of anecdotally realized that people were sometimes getting ordained who were not the most suitable people. And the feeling was that they were people who managed to get trained by paying to go to a theological college, and were then able to kind of travel around the country until they found a bishop who was either unobservant or soft-hearted enough to ordain them. And then, of course, they become basically a nuisance to the church because they either couldn't find a job, or if they did, they weren't very successful. And so there was a feeling there needed to be some kind of process nationally. And the post-war era was a great era, actually, of, by modern standards, centralization, effectively, of the church. And there was also the need to deal with servicemen who weren't really attached to any locality, and some of whom were feeling a call. And so a national process emerged, but legally, what it is, it's a gentleman's agreement between the bishops, or we might now say a ladies and gentlemen's agreement, I suppose, in that the bishops effectively agreed to pool their decision-making and to say, we will send candidates to these organized panels that this secretariat is going to run for us. They will give us recommendations, and that's the key word, thinking about it legally. The panels, which the formats kept changing, but the principle is the same, send a recommendation to the bishop, say, yes, we do believe this person is called and does not have any reasons why they're not suitable for ordination, or we don't. But ultimately, it's then up to the bishop themselves to say, yes, in my authority as bishop, I accept that recommendation, or not, that this person is suitable for training. The other bit of it, which is not quite legal, but it's a bit of administrative cunning, which somebody, possibly Geoffrey Fisher, thought of, was that only by putting out candidates through that process are the central funds, which are voted through by General Synod, released to pay for the training. Mm-hmm. And that obviously secures a degree of, as it were, if not quite legality, at least authority to it. But there can be exceptions, and particularly for self-supporting candidates, and particularly old self-supporting candidates may have quite short training, bishops do have the discretion just to make their own decision and to say, actually, I think this person is good enough outside of the national process. There's strong encouragement to make sure all the kind of safeguards are there, and we can afford to find a way to train them, because actually sending someone on a course is potentially within budgets, and so they can ordain at will. And sometimes DDOs have to, well, we are merely the servants of our bishops in terms of process and decision making.
That's really interesting. That certainly explains, Neil, why we don't find much in the canons. And I suppose in a similar vein, obviously you mentioned the word Ordinand. It's in your title, Diocesan Director of Ordinands. And as I remember from once, the moment that I was recommended for training by a selection conference, I was referred to as an ordinand for the next 3.5 years or whatever. But again, ordinand isn't something, as far as I'm aware, one really finds very much in the formal law of the church as a word.
No, it is odd. It really doesn't exist. And I think probably the only place it's formally now found is that the new ordinal, the common worship ordinal, refers to those who are coming on the very day itself as ordinands. But the standing of being an ordinand from being recommended for training or starting training at a college or course, yes, is quite unofficial. And yet it was interesting, certainly when I was an ordinand, which is now 20 years ago, nearly 20 years ago, there was nothing more to it than that. And yet it was assumed that as ordinands, we went on placement to parishes, and it was assumed that we were able to preach, trial sermons to be observed and commented on, and we were able to assist with communion and do various things that actually normally require distinct authorization. And that just seems to have happened, as it were. Yes.
Sure, no, that's interesting. And then I suppose, leading on from that, you've explained how most of the processes for selection are in one sense informal. They're formal in another sense, but legally speaking, they're perhaps more of an informal agreement. But there is an exception, isn't there, when we come to a faculty process around people, whether a divorce is with remarriage.
Indeed, and again, one can follow where this comes from. Of course, in the Church of England, there was for many, many decades great controversy over remarriage after divorce. And in the end, the way in which agreement was secured in synod, that people who had been divorced and remarried, or indeed who had married people who were previously married, spouse of the candidate, could proceed to ordination, was that they should all be considered very carefully. And so this was incorporated into the canons in Canon C4, which is about the status of those candidates for ordination. And it prescribes in quite a lot of depth a procedure whereby the bishop who wants to ordain them has to obtain a faculty from the archbishops. So the person seeking is the bishop, who is seeking permission to overturn what would otherwise be an impediment. And there is a process which is, the archbishops have the power to vary this, but the basic rules are set out in an appendix to the canon. The candidate has to provide a kind of narrative of what happened in the marital history. There's an officer delegated in most dioceses. Some DDOs do it, but mostly there's an independent person found. In this diocese, it's a retired bishop, it's a retired archdeacon, someone with that degree of experience, who meets the candidate and their spouse and effectively gently inquires about the story, and also receives names of referees who are, as it were, independent witnesses that this is a genuine narrative, because there's a need to show that the divorce is not, as it were, a matter of bad character or scandal to the church. And they then provide a report, and then the candidate sees the bishop, who effectively checks it for themselves. The bishop then has to send that as an application, in our case to Lambeth, to Bishop Thorpe in the north. And the archbishops themselves have to approve it. There's an officer administers all this, and what then comes back is a as it were, a personal faculty for that candidate, which has been signed by both archbishops. It sometimes creates delays in the process, because we have to ring up and is it at Lambeth? Has it been approved in principle? Has it got to the archbishop's desk yet? Is it in the post to York? And so on. That then gives the bishop permission to overturn what would otherwise be an impediment to ordination.
I see. And are there other impediments and other similar processes?
The only one which is of, as it were, similar character is strangely old and new, and this is a faculty for those who have committed great crimes. If you read in the prayer book ordinal, it states that when the interrogation is made in the ordination, if there should be discovered any great crime, as the exact words, committed by the candidate, the bishop should not ordain them until he finds out what the problem is. And remarkably, this sat dormant in the prayer book seemingly for 3.5 centuries, until quite a recent case only a few years ago. And I don't know the details because it's quite rightly confidential, but of a candidate who actually had committed a very serious crime in their youth many years ago. And yet the diocese felt that this, they had had a change of life and a conversion and so on. And so, but the question was, is this still a problem? And so the faculty was determined that actually, yes, there should be a process. And so there is now, as it were, an equivalent process, and it deals with any crime which has involved a prison sentence of more than 7 years or any sexual offence, which means that, again, that it can be looked into at a national level. It kind of lifts it from the diocese having to make a decision about somebody they know. And again, it's about an issue of a faculty by the archbishops to overcome the impediment.
Interesting. Yeah, I'm sure that's something that not a lot of people probably are aware of. Doesn't crop up too often, I expect.
No, or if you're very diligent, that most of these things are somewhere in the depths of the Church of England website in the kind of pages of information for DDOs, but they're the bit that most people never are aware exists, never mind read.
Sure. So having someone's come to see you and they've got any of these necessary faculties that they need. They've been selected by usually national selection processes. Then they go through a period of training. Presumably they stay in touch with you.
Indeed, and we receive reports that they either go away to residential college or they go to a course, evening based, or some now based on 1 day a week, St. Mellitus in London. Obviously, they don't serve Hereford very much, but the colleges return reports to us, and there's a reasonably well laid down process. It's all House of Bishops policy rather than canon or law, but the report that is received a year before the end of training is, as it were, the decisive one, which should say, well, almost invariably, yes, this candidate is ready for ordination in a year, we believe. Very exceptionally, there will be a problem. Hopefully, we would know about that in advance, but that's part of my work to liaise and identify any issues that have arisen if there are serious problems for a candidate. And then we start talking about planning where they're going to minister, where their curacy is going to be the following year.
Yeah, and but then ultimately the decision is, as you said, the bishops, the diocesan bishops, so when it comes then to the time of ordination, I suppose there are then various processes that need to be undergone. I mean, the first one I think of is, you've already alluded to, is finding a title, because nobody can be ordained without a title.
Indeed, everyone must be ordained to a specific place. The exception, which I feel sure members of the Ecclesiastical Law Society are all familiar with, is that fellows of colleges in Oxford and Cambridge are entitled to be ordained on the strength of their fellowship. I can't remember when the last case was. There have been some in the last 20 years, I think. But normally, even candidates who are going to be self-supporting, stay in their working life, are still ordained to a particular place, which may be the place they live, or it may indeed be a neighbouring parish. Sometimes it's better for them to learn and train in. And so we settle those. There are conversations between incumbents and would-be curates, and eventually endorsed by the bishop. And from that, we then draw up the ordination documentation. So when people are ordained, there's quite a certain amount of legal paperwork produced. On the day they have to receive their letters of orders, which is the document which proves that you have been ordained, a license to the place where they go to minister, and what I've always called a reading in document. I might come back to that because that follows the ordination. And certainly in this diocese, where if you look at the Diocese of Hereford, very rural, lots of groups of parishes joined together, there is almost always some triangular correspondence between the bishop's office and me and the registry to make sure we get the names of the parishes right, because there are quite a lot of informal names for groups of parishes. Some of them have been legally made by pastoral order, some of them have not. Some of them are recorded in the diocesan database in the form that's not actually legal. So, you know, when you're talking about, as I was ordained to, Clibri Mortimer with Hopton Wafers, Neen Sollers and Milson, Neen Savage and Kinlet with Doddington, it's quite easy to see that a word or two might be out of place.
Absolutely. And so when that documentation has been sorted out, I suppose the candidates also have to provide proof of certain things through documentation, such as their baptism.
Indeed, candidates need to be able to prove they're baptized and confirmed, usually just by producing the relevant certificates. Just occasionally, they find this difficult, perhaps particularly older candidates, it's a long time ago. There are cases, we don't make too much fuss of them, of people who have to be conditionally baptized in order to prove it. Sometimes diocesan registries are happy with something like a baptismal confirmation Bible if it's got a plate in the front. Particularly, say, a confirmation Bible signed by the bishop is sometimes accepted adequate proof in the absence of a certificate. We had quite an interesting case last year in Hereford of a lady who had been brought up Roman Catholic and baptized and confirmed as Roman Catholic in her youth. And she thought she didn't have a certificate of confirmation. And I was much helped by this learned society, because during the drear days of lockdown, I was part of a group looking at the principles of ecclesiastical law. And we have a learned Roman Catholic member, Paul Barber, and he said, well, the Roman Catholic practice is normally that the original baptism certificate has space for annotations. And I think you might find the proof of a confirmation is there. And the next day I got back in touch and I said, could you just send me a scan of your baptism certificate again? And I looked, and there it was on the line, all in Latin, of course. This was done in, I think, 60s. Perfectly adequate evidence of her confirmation. And the problem was happily solved.
Oh, fantastic!
So
that
was you know, the ELS came to my aid, as it were.
Yeah, wonderful. You mentioned that something reading in papers.
Yes. So there are two aspects to this. So before the ordination, I think it's probably most dioceses, certainly here we do it at the beginning of the ordination retreat, just a few days before the ordination. The candidates have to make their declaration under the canons and their oaths of allegiance to the sovereign and obedience to the bishop, and those are recorded. And some of you, of course, may know that for people starting a ministry in a parish, those are often done at the induction service in the parish. Because the candidates have done them with the bishop, as it were, privately before the ordination, there is a process to make sure their new parish knows that they are, as it were, loyal. And so they are issued with a document, and at their first service in their new parish as curates, or the first major service we ask them to do it, they have to repeat the declaration of assent and their oaths in the hearing of the parishioners. And that document is then signed by the church wardens as witnesses and returned to the diocesan registry.
Right, excellent. So this is all really interesting stuff, Neil. I suppose perhaps the last thing we might want to talk about is what effect the pandemic has had on your work. You mentioned the ELS reading groups, of course, but that aside, when it comes, I suppose much of what you talked about, correspondence, obviously perhaps hasn't been affected, but have ordination services?
Yes, I mean, stepping back, I suppose, I feel very lucky that I've been able to carry on a lot of my work. You know, I haven't had to make decisions about churches and closing of services. The discernment process went online. So candidates who would have gone to residential interview panels had Zoom panels.
Right.
And I also serve as a bishop's advisor, so I've interviewed people on Zoom panels. So all the people starting training for ordination since the beginning of the pandemic have been seen in this format. The ordinations themselves, yes, last year was more restricted than this year. Last year, different dioceses chose to do slightly different things. We decided that last July, things were still too serious to have an ordination, because ordination canonically and theologically requires the bishop to put his hands on the candidates physically. And that clearly is the opposite of social distancing. So in common with many dioceses, those candidates who were due to be ordained in July were admitted as lay workers, which simply requires the handing over of a license from a plastic folder dropped into their hands, you know, and we were able to have a fully distanced service with a minimal number of people in the cathedral to do that, which meant that those who had stipendiary were able to begin to minister in a lay capacity in their parishes and to be paid their stipend, which in all fairness, they needed. And so we then held the ordinations in September, delayed by 3 months. And the Church of England nationally issued guidance. We did it in a minimal form. We had 30 people in the cathedral, all spaced out, and the laying on of hands. Different people have done different places. I was the one who followed the bishop with the sanitizer. So between laying hands on each candidate, he was able to duly clean. And for the ordination of priests, where normally in Hereford, as many places, we have a sort of scrum of everyone laying on hands at once, the candidates only received 3 pairs of hands, the bishops, their training incumbents, and me, because that was deemed to be a sufficient way of honouring the tradition of the presbyters joining in the ordination of priests. So that was all quite carefully worked out, although of course in many ways a much simpler service. limited music. This year, we were able to have something much more like a full ordination service. We still weren't singing hymns, of course, although the candidates were rather lucky. We had our ordination retreat just over the border in Wales. So we were able to sing on the retreat, if not at the service. The Hereford Cathedral will fit about 200 socially distanced. So we had to be much more ticketed. But then a week before the ordination, the Bishop of Hereford, who is now the only bishop, as it were, permanent bishop in this diocese, we don't have a suffragan, was in contact with somebody who had tested positive. And so he was obliged to self-isolate over the period of the ordination. So the nearest he got to the candidates was at the beginning of the retreat. We had a Eucharist in his garden on the lawn, and he appeared for an attic window on the roof. And he did bless the candidates.
How very papal that sounds.
At least, I think he was a good, good 20 yards away. And we had to ask one of the retired bishops, honorary assistant bishops in the diocese, who stepped in very graciously at very short notice to actually ordain. And our great frustration was that there's a lovely photograph of the bishop on the roof, but the Church Times didn't choose to use it for the caption competition, to our disappointment.
Well, that's fascinating. I mean, it's good to know that you're able to circumvent all the difficulties and things were able to go ahead. This has been a really fascinating conversation, Neil. Thanks so much for your time. It's really interesting to hear some of these areas that very much touch ecclesiastical law, but because, as you've said, it's not central to any particular canon or measure, is sometimes overlooked in the world of ecclesiastical law. So it's been a really interesting conversation. Good to talk to you.
Glad to talk to you and glad to share a bit of it.
And see you soon. Bye.
Thank you.